Michael Kelly of Business Insider had an incredible report about how the DEA is working with a Mexican drug cartel. What happened to the war on drugs? I thought that, all drugs are the worst thing in the world and we need to spend $1 trillion fighting them and we need to militarize our police force and we need to make sure little Johnny doesn't get his fingers on a joint. Well, you're working with a drug cartel in Mexico? You're working with the enemy then. What you've been feeding to us is bullshit. I'm so surprised. Between the year 2000 and 2012, the U.S. government had an agreement with Mexico's Sinaloa drug cartel that allowed the organization to smuggle billions of dollars worth of drugs into the U.S. in exchange for information on rival cartels. So do you get that? They're saying the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if my enemy is all these drug cartels, and if I make friends with one drug cartel, then they'll give up the other drug cartels, and I'll crack down on the rest of the drug cartels, but I'll let this one drug cartel continue to be a drug cartel and continue to give, leak all these things through the border into the U.S. In fact, this particular cartel supplied 80% of the drugs in Chicago and some other places. Now, keep Chicago in mind because I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. Court documents have testimony from a DEA agent and a Justice Department official about this. So now the information is verified. It's not just, speculation. Quote, in the late 1990s, Castro struck a deal with U.S. agents in which Sinaloa would provide information about rival drug trafficking organizations, while the U.S. would dismiss its case against the Sinaloa lawyer and refrain from interfering with Sinaloa drug trafficking activities or actively prosecute Sinaloa leadership. The agent stated that this arrangement had been approved by high-ranking officials and federal prosecutors. And remember, this spans 3 administrations. In the late 1990s, under Bill Clinton, under the entire reign of George W. Bush, and then also under the Obama administration. We cut a deal with a drug cartel and let them act with complete immunity from U.S. law. We said, you know what, we're never going to come after you under any circumstances. You can leak in whatever drugs you want. Because you're feeding information to us about other cartels, you can do whatever you want to do. Wow, man. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not naive. I don't think that, there's not backroom deals going on to try to get bad people all the time. In fact, I understand that's part of law enforcement. That's the whole purpose of plea bargainings, is to do this sort of negotiation that gets some kind of justice, even if you can't get full justice. But realize how ridiculous this is when you compare it to the stated goal of the war on drugs. I mean, we talked about there was a UN announcement in like the late 1980s or early 1990s where they said our goal is to eliminate drugs on the planet, illegal drugs. Oh, that's rich. That is rich. I mean, not only have we not seen them eliminated, we've seen more drugs in the U.S. and they're cheaper. There's been a net increase in drug use after we spent $1 trillion trying to curtail drug use. I mean, the war on drugs has been an abject failure, not to mention the 60,000 deaths on the border between Mexico and Texas as a result of the drug war. And you're also strengthening the cartels when you have drugs that are illegal, which leads to my one of my final points on this, which is if you actually wanted to get rid of the cartels, you wouldn't make deals with them or one of them and allow them to operate without you cracking down on them. The way to get rid of the cartels would be to legalize the drugs. Because guess what? You think that this Mexican drug cartel is going to be able to compete with, Anheuser-Busch if they wanted to get into the weed game? Or Google if they wanted to get into the weed game? Google wouldn't be able to sell marijuana at a cheaper price and sell more pure marijuana? No, the thing is, the illegal groups could not function if weed was legal or if drugs were legal, because they're criminals. What they do is criminal shit. You know, when there's a problem, they take out AK-47s and try to solve it that way. Those people are not going to be able to function when it's in a civilized arena, when you bring drugs into a civilized arena and make it so that if there's a problem, people go to court and wear suit and ties in order to figure out our differences. If you legalize it, the cartels go away. And you might say, well, Kyle, how do you know? You're just guessing. This is just opinion. Not true at all. If you look back in the United States, when alcohol was illegal, what happened when there was alcohol prohibition? Gangs popped up to sell the alcohol. That's where the mafia got a lot of its strength from, back in that time frame. So 20s, 30s, and then until the amendment was passed. So, okay, it's the easiest thing in the world to stop the problems associated with drugs, the violent crime associated with drugs. Just make them legal and regulate them like alcohol. Notice you don't see gangsters selling alcohol anymore, do you? Why? Because they can't compete with the actual alcohol companies. You don't see people dying either from drinking alcohol that was cut in a bathtub with toxic chemicals, right? Because there's regulation of how the alcohol is made now, so they don't make it in a bullshit kind of way, which is going to lead to people getting sick and possibly even dying. And then remember when I said I'd come back to this point about Chicago? Last thing here. Now, this is me getting slightly conspiratorial, but I think it's curious that the feds allowed the drugs into certain places and not into others. So if this cartel supplied 80% of the drugs in Chicago, right? And if they supplied their drugs in other, areas that are considered to be fairly ghetto nowadays, so Detroit is another example, or certain places in New York City, if the feds allow the drugs to go into those places when they cut a deal with this leader of the drug cartel, well, then maybe there is some merit to, the old conspiracy theory of, well, the federal government is behind crack. The federal government is behind, trying to keep the African-American communities down and trying to keep poor communities down by allowing drugs and everything in there without giving them any opportunity in terms of access to a job and an education and medical care. Now, I'm not saying that's definitely the case, but if the federal government knew, because they're doing business with the guy, that they're going to approve the places where he can send his drugs to, and he sent over $1 billion worth of drugs into the U.S., I'm not surprised that they didn't say, hey, man, you can go ahead and ship those drugs to Orange County or Westchester County, New York, or other high-income counties. They wouldn't allow that. They would only allow it to go to Chicago and Detroit and these other places where the people in the government say, they're run-down African-American poor areas anyway, so send it in there.